Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, welcome back to Cosmic Shenanigans. This is Mary SanGiovanni, up to shenanigans of cosmic proportions, as always. This week, we are going to be talking about a short story called The Hounds of Tindalos by Frank Belknap Long. This story originally appeared in Weird Tales in March of 1929. It is most definitely a Lovecraftian story, with little elements that I've noticed of modern cosmic horror, which I think are pretty fascinating. It's a combination of narration and that classic epistolary letter type format that a lot of Lovecraft's work was in, and a lot of work at the time, generally speaking, was in. But a lot of Lovecraftian horror was in that format. What we have is essentially a writer, journalist, amateur anthropologist, Chalmers, right? And he's sort of an explorer of the occult, okay? He's looking for knowledge. So again, we have that sort of Lovecraftian guy on the fringes of society, somewhat, who is on a quest, an almost obsessive quest, for knowledge beyond what we know. In this case, and this is what I think interesting, is at the beginning of this story goes to some trouble comparing science and magic. We have two characters, Chalmers and the narrator, who is Frank. And Frank is of the belief that science is the way to go, that science is an important aspect, and progression of technology, progression of the modern. Whereas Chalmers is of a much more traditional, much more esoteric aesthetic. His home furnishings reflects that. His writings reflect that. But maybe most interestingly, his new approach to finding the secrets of the universe involves using both science and the occult. He's using a little bit of magic and a little bit of science. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing because, as we've talked about in the past, Lovecraft was a big believer in things that could be proven. He was not a believer in the supernatural. He liked even his supernatural aspects to be grounded in some type of science, some type of fact, So I like that this approach acknowledges that there's a sense that, if we use the occult and science, that we're just increasing our chances. We're maybe even exponentially increasing our chances that we'll achieve a certain goal of finding this sort of esoteric knowledge. What he explains to Frank is that he has found the formula for a drug from China that used to be used in ancient China, and that this drug will allow him to travel through time. So maybe you're noticing a theme here. Last week we talked about time as well. If I can break down Frank Belknap Long's theory about time and space here, it's kind of interesting. He presents time as a repository dimension for the past and the present. That the only reason we can't time travel, forwards or backwards, is that because these events that maybe, say, happened in the past are still existing, they're still occurring, but they occur in a dimension that we can't access, that we can't travel to, because of limitations in the way that we move through time and space. But that essentially time and space are kind of the same thing. Time, the way we think of it, as a passage of moments, is illusory, that really what we're looking at is a flexibility of different planes of reality and existence. And that he claims that with a combination of this Chinese drug and with certain mathematical formulas, he can not only access the past and the present and the future all simultaneously as landscapes or vistas that he can observe, but also understand what it is that he's seeing through these scientific means and these mathematical principles. He calls on Frank to be an observer and to help him, return from the effects of this drug, and to take note of everything that he's saying, everything that he's experiencing, so that he can refer to it later and try to collate and aggregate all of this information into something useful. The experiment happens. He regresses through history. And Frank Belknap Long has a way of describing things like Clark Ashton Smith, is what I'm trying to say. He talks about the movement through time and history. And it's really kind of fascinating. It's almost beautiful the way he describes human civilization throughout time and his movement backwards through it. Okay. Now his movement backwards through it is not the same as last week's episode when we talked about Clark Ashton Smith. He remains himself. But in remaining himself and being cognizant of who he is also aware of being every person that ever was, that ever existed at any time, and is sort of simultaneously experiencing all of the things that have happened all throughout time. Now, if that's not enough to overwhelm a person, but wait, there's more. He regresses even further. He regresses to Neanderthals and to creatures pre-Neanderthal. He regresses to so far back that he discovers the space. The best way to describe it would be that he discovers a place that exists outside of space and time, that existed before space and time, that essentially the divergence of space and time, it was a divergence from this thing, this place, this existence, this plane of reality. What I find interesting is that some of his description of this sounds almost Judeo-Christian. Almost. He almost describes the beings that exist in this place, this before place, as being like the way we describe demons. He mentions snakes and trees and apples, which is sort of biblical of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. He mentions that the closest way to describe these things are the way that we have described fallen ones, fallen angels. So there's a reference to these things as being demons, or to maybe be more precise, that demons were a thing that is outside of what we come to think of as demons that existed before all of this. He also makes reference to the idea that a deed happened. He calls it a deed. Some inciting incident happened, which caused space and time to exist, and caused different modes of travel through these things. He mentions a lot. He says that there's no good or evil because there's no sense of right or wrong, but that there is a sense of foulness and cleanliness, and that the cleanliness pathway was a development of space and time, but that the foulness, whatever fell behind after this deed, became these beings. They became receptacles for all of the foulness that did not move forward into what we come to think of today as actual existence. He calls these beings the Hounds of Tindalos. Now, they're not hounds because they look dog-like. I get the impression that he describes them that way because they are lean and beast-like and very hungry. He says they have a cosmic hunger. In a way, in reading this, it almost reminded me a little bit of the Langoliers. Like, these are just devouring entities. That's what they do. They just devour things. And he also mentions that they can pick up on our scents, and the scent of cleanliness, the scent of innocence, whatever is left in us that's what it finds. That's what these things come after. That's what they can smell. But that because much like we've talked about with Yog-Sothoth and Ubosathla last week in our episode, where we talked about these beings that exist before time and space, that are outside of our structure of even good and evil, but are such, mega entities that really they would never even know we exist until we poke at them. And then it's unleashing like a cosmic force, like a black hole. That's what these things are. They probably would never have even known we were here, except that he moved through time and compounded the efforts, the effects of what he was doing with both science and magic, so that they did notice. They did notice that he was here, and they did catch his scent, basically. Now, one of the other interesting aspects that I do kind of love, and I don't see it explored very often, except Lovecraft did explore it in his story Dreams in the Witch House. It's this idea that other dimensions are accessible by traveling through the curves or angles of space and time. Now, Long says that what is good and right in the world, what we come to know as our reality, our universe, our sense of normalcy, is whatever can travel through curves, whatever vibrates at that frequency, I guess, that it travels through the curves of the universe, the curves of space and time. And he even acknowledges Einstein's theory about time as traveling along curves. The angles are what the Hounds of Tindalos travel. That one of the reasons why we don't run into these creatures more often, or creatures from the angles of space and time, is because those who travel through curves are different than those who travel through angles, and that they can't cross pathways. They can't move through something that isn't built the right way. And I love this idea. I think it's almost like in those dreams where you find that right layer of the air to jump into so that you can fly. It's like that idea that all of the secrets of pockets of reality or doorways to other dimensions exists in geometry and architecture and the difference between curves and angles. I think it's really kind of a cool idea. Now, what we find, though, in the story, Chalmers tries to, because in having contacted them, another reason why I think he calls these beings hounds, the Hounds of Tindalos, is because they're hunters. They can smell his scent through time and space, the way hounds are supposed to be able to smell it over great distances, miles and miles, and they can track him. And that's what they're doing. They're tracking his scent. And because he has been exposed to the powers of perception over different dimensions, he knows they're coming for him. So he decides that, and it's actually not a bad plan, he decides that he's got to eliminate all of the angles where he is and make a sort of spherical or orb-like room. So all of the corners of the room he rounds out with plaster of Paris. He gets Frank to buy this plaster of Paris and help him round out corners. All the sharp edges of the window seats, the floors, where the floors and the walls meet, where the walls and the ceilings meet. Any kind of angle, he rounds it out, because he's sure that it's through angles that they will be able to access this world. And then ultimately, of course, as always happens in a Lovecraftian story, there's a cost to pursuing knowledge, and it's usually at the expense of the pursuer. An earthquake causes all of the plaster to crack. And of course, it doesn't crack in nice, neat, round little orbs. It cracks in angles, sharp angles. And that ends badly for Chalmers, of course. What we have then thematically in this Lovecraftian story is a step past what we also usually see in Lovecraftian stories, in that neither science nor occult magic, nor the most careful combination of both, can protect us from things in other dimensions which exist outside of space and time. And a lot of Lovecraftian stories, a lot of cosmic horror stories, maybe science can't help us, but ancient occult knowledge can, or vice versa. Maybe it requires something more powerful than a few ancient spells to get rid of something. But what we have here is the idea that even in using both, we're not safe. Even in using a combination of both, we can still create something disastrous, which is sort of reminiscent, I guess, of our episode that we did on CERN. This idea that in combining science and esoteric knowledge, we're somehow creating an even bigger problem, as opposed to arming ourselves with twice the weaponry to fight this off, that we're actually compounding the problem. We're basically reminded in a story like this of the powerlessness of the human race in the faces of forces we can't understand. We don't have the tools to go beyond space and time, and we maybe don't have the temperament, we maybe don't have the intellectual or psychological wherewithal to handle what we find, even if we did. And it doesn't get much more cosmic horror than that. It doesn't get much more cosmic horror than the idea that we are opening doorways to creatures and to powers that are ultimately far beyond anything that the human race is capable of handling at this point. And I think that this is smartly done in this story by acknowledging this sort of modern, and I say modern, although it's 1929, it was modern for their time. I mean, he's pulling in scientific principles and technology and math and the whole nine yards. This idea of combining the two into what we think is finally going to make us well equipped enough to handle the secrets of the universe. And it turns out that all it does is create an even bigger problem. Because there is, as always in Lovecraftian and cosmic horror stories, the notion that if it could get to one of us, there is nothing to say that it can't get to all of us. That these creatures that get to Calmers, where did they go when they were done with them? What happens now that the world is full of angles and they know that we're here at the end of this angular path? And that's what I find fascinating about this story is this acknowledgement of our pulling our best resources together, and it's still not enough. It still reinforces the idea of humanity's insignificance and powerlessness in the face of cosmic horrors far greater than anything we can imagine. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, you can listen to other Cosmic Horror episodes on Project Entertainment Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and all other platforms where podcasts are available. You can listen to it for free, always for free. I'd like to thank Matt Wilderson, who is not only an awesome engineer handling things in Dave's absence, but also an cosmic horror author himself. His short story collection, Horrors Untold, is available now. You can pick that up, and it's got some good cosmic horror-y goodness in it. And also, again, if you would consider donating to Dave's GoFundMe to help with his medical costs, we would really appreciate it. If you go to GoFundMe and type in Dave Thomas, his GoFundMe will come up, and anything you can do to help, we would really appreciate it. Thanks for everything, and I will see you all next week. Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, Project Entertainment Network presents the Mondo Method.
An old man with a goatee teaches a younger guy with a beard how to write.
Introducing first, he's the mentor and the greatest manager of all time, Mondo Guerrero. And from parts unknown, up-and-coming superstar, the Great Buddha.
Okay, so maybe their names are really just Armand Rosamelia and Chuck Buddha, and maybe you'll learn something while they're at it. Wednesdays exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.